Hello, thank you for joining me today. I'm here to talk a little bit about prison and more specifically the ethics used to justify incarceration, something that seems more and more pertinent than ever in light of what we've seen recently, from police shootings to mass incarceration, overall what would appear to be an increase in grave injustices, and what I mean by injustice I'll clarify later on. I also want to add, before I say anything else, that there's only so much that any of us individually can add to the discourse on the matter, especially I as a person of white privilege. It's important to listen to the voices of the people who are most directly affected, the most marginalized. We live in an age of colorblindness, as Michelle Alexander puts it, and I think that's demonstrated to such an extreme degree in the fact that many people seem completely unaware of the racial segregation and oppression that exists today, and that's very blatantly evident when we look at the prison industrial complex, the police state, and how they operate. So before I get too much into that, I want to talk about the actual theory behind punishment at a state level, because when you talk about it, it seems rather odd that a state can justify doing harm to its citizens. The state has used punishment as kind of a utilitarian tool to keep us in check, and there are many theorists who will assert that the goal of incarceration is primarily to prevent repeat offenses. There's problems with this theory, however, that we run into. H.J. McCloskey, in his essay about non-utilitarian justification, gives the example of a black man who was lynched on unjustified grounds merely to appease the demands of the people, and in theory, this is beneficial because it deters future criminals from committing a crime, regardless of whether or not the person who was punished actually committed it. The thing that's really scary about this ideology, and even that example particularly, is that it's not just a hypothetical, it's actually been put into practice so much. Aside from what we might look at as the obvious moral roadblock here, that being that it allows innocent people to be punished and put to death, is that it actually becomes self-defeating for society as a whole, because you're taking citizens, people who live and work and breathe under capitalism, and nullifying their potential to be part of civilization. And now as I say this, I don't want you to think that I am refuting the idea that economic growth takes precedence over human lives. What I'm saying is that it's self-defeating to its own ends, and we can see that really the justice system has not always functioned this way. Industrialization of the Western world has propagated this idea that people are synonymous with production, and economic value can be given to each individual person who occupies a cell. Now, the way that the state has solved this problem is by turning prisoners into production, and this becomes more and more evident as more prisons become privatized. Prisoners of corporate prisons generate hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and to me, what that constitutes is a gross subversion of what the ethics of punishment claim to be, and prisons really just become a money laundering scheme for the super rich. So alternatively, another form of moral justification for prison is retributivism, which is a form of deontological justice. There's a lot more nuance to the distinctions between ethical schools of thought than I claim to have knowledge of or am prepared to explain, but put succinctly, this is the idea that punishment should be meted out of duty or out of adherence to moral principle or law. There's a lot more nuance, like I said, but I think the most interesting thing about the system of ethics is that it appears to be on the decline. If someone, for instance, steals from you, you can't usually expect to receive compensation for what was taken from you, but you might expect that person to go to jail. The main problem we run into here is that the effectiveness, or perhaps I should say the logical strength of this idea rests upon our ability to properly dole out punishment in proportion to the offense. So when we look at the numbers, the statistics, it would appear that there's really no system in place to mandate this in our prison system. One study found that privatized prison inmates served on average an additional 90 days in prison in comparison to state prison inmates, and they were served with twice as many infractions. Now, to me, it seems incredibly unlikely to think that the severity of the crimes of the inmates in the privatized prisons could possibly be proportionately worse than the state prisoners. It's highly improbable, at least, that there's any real grounds for believing that. People in jail for petty misdemeanors inhabit the same living conditions as people who commit heinous crimes. They don't suffer any better or any worse. Suffering itself is quite subjective, really, so it's hard to say how people individually experience punishment or whether or not it's truly feasible to measure its severity or its proportionality with any degree of accuracy. So going back to the topic of marginalized people, the thing about these individuals, these humans who are sentenced and thrown in prison, is that there's an overwhelming racial bias. Over half of the prison population in the United States is composed of people of color. Now, I don't want to go off on a tangent because in some ways prison abolition is a separate issue than that of racism and bigotry. However, they're also very much the same issue in the context of what we're facing in the world today, which is institutionalized racism, institutionalized violence, and injustice. And in the prison system is a tool of the state which allows these things to exist and take place. I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about an injustice, we're not talking simply about what makes it unjust. We're talking about all of the implications and the effects as well. Prisons affect people of color, trans people, gay and queer people, the working class as a whole. So to go into the multifaceted ways in which all of these diverse issues intersect could literally take up entire books, which it has. So in conclusion, I'd like to offer some recommended reading. The first book that I have here is called Policing the Planet, and I just recently picked this up from the library, and I haven't finished it yet, but it's about kind of the context that's given as our current state of affairs when it comes to racial relationships in the United States. It's a compilation of essays, and it features an interview with the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as an interview with the leaders of the Red Nation, which is anti-colonial indigenous council here in New Mexico. It's a really good read so far. I haven't finished it, but I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to read it. It's really good to know the kinds of recent history that's led up to what's going on right now. I think that's really important. The next one I have is by Angela Davis, and she's actually written another book specifically about prison abolition called Are Prisons Obsolete?, which is really good. It talks a lot about the treatment of women and people of color within the prison system and the correlation between slavery and mass incarceration. This one is mostly about women's suffrage, but there's actually a chapter in here towards the end called The Myth of the Black Rapist, and that speaks very directly of our cultural bigotry and prejudices against black people, and specifically black men as predators, and that's an idea that we really need to break down and do away with. I think it's one of those kind of internalized racist ideas that we may not be entirely aware of until we really pay attention to them and dissect them, because they become so ingrained in our society as a whole. So definitely read some of her work if you get the chance. She's an absolutely brilliant person and scholar. The last one I have here is Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault, who's one of my favorite philosophers of the last century. It's kind of a dense read, but what he does is take a historian's approach kind of to looking at our culture, our ideas, and kind of tries to make us see that we take for granted our position in history, because we tend to think we are incredibly advanced and that the way we do things has been better than anyone else before us. He describes a scene in this book where after the guillotine has been invented, and in Europe, and the crowd chants back at the executioner, "Give us back our gallows," and extrapolates that this was a people who were angry that their ability to punish and enact justice had been taken away out of their hands and had been put into the hands of the state. So the book as well, if you have the patience to read it, I highly recommend. Now, I don't necessarily believe in the absence of punishment. I believe very much in prison abolition for all the reasons I've given you here, namely that every moral justification of the prison system falls short of what it tries to do. Without prisons, we would not have mass incarceration, institutionalized segregation of people of color, or all of the things that come with that. I don't think that reform can necessarily do much good if the principles we operate upon from the very start are broken and ineffectual to suit the needs of the civilization. I don't have a solution, so to speak, in the sense that I personally am not capable of instilling my moral convictions directly into the world. Change doesn't happen overnight, in other words. I think education is important, though, and it's going to continue to be important, so please take my words with a grain of salt and do some reading and research yourself, and thank you for watching.